She was born a nobody, a teenage girl with no throne, no army, and no claim to power. But through cunning, vision, and ruthless brilliance, she didn't just survive the Russian court, she conquered it. This is the extraordinary rise of Catherine the Great, one of the most powerful women in history. If you enjoy true stories of ambition, betrayal, and empire, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more cinematic history brought to life through storytelling.
Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform and icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she was the daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of power. But Sophie herself, she had something no title could provide: razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother Johanna was cold and calculating, not a warm, nurturing figure, but a social climber obsessed with status. Her father, a Prussian officer, was more distant than disciplinarian. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, and learned how to observe a room before speaking in it, skills that would soon become survival tools in one of Europe's most brutal courts. When Empress Elizabeth Petrovna began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter himself was of German descent, and Empress Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, pliable and grateful, would be easier to control. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. Noble blood, Lutheran faith, which she'd have to abandon, and a reputation for both grace and humility. At just 14 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the freezing capital of St. Petersburg wearing thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece. Sophie, however, had her own game in mind. To become acceptable in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna.
The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions, she was burning the bridge behind her, stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. No one watching that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have predicted what would come next: betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Sophie stepped foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was meant to secure her place in Russian royalty, but from the very beginning it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. Awkward, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he was far more interested in playing war games in his chambers than governing an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. In contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted to escape. This mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline. Everyone knew a transition was coming, and everyone had an agenda. Catherine was watched constantly. Her letters were read, her friendships monitored, and her every move scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who was still whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight. But Catherine was no fool. She learned to play the court's games quietly, cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, made friends with scholars, and developed a reputation for dignity and restraint, a stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and open contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw her as a young consort, she was building a vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. But there was one problem. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, planned. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be taken. After nearly 20 years of waiting, watching, and quietly maneuvering, Catherine saw her moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter, now Peter III, was Tsar. But his reign began unraveling almost immediately. In just a few short months, Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed key policies, humiliated the clergy, and talked openly about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, grumbled in corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move. While Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'état. Supported by key military officers, including her lover Grigory Orlov and his influential brothers, she rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity.
It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power, gained through intrigue, could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her power. But she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia, not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even if she herself ruled with absolute authority. Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakaz, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, one that spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical. But Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern, on her terms. And that meant reform, yes, but with an iron hand in a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not just for defending her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars weren't just about territory. They were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian czars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish.
By the end of the Third Partition, in 1795, Poland was erased from the map, and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies. She also colonized with ideas. New cities were built. Trade routes were expanded. German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia, she wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them. Many decades younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Grigory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, he was her co-ruler in many ways. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal.
Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumors only got worse. The most infamous being the completely false and grotesque tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically. And in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms. And that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships didn't have to threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers managed. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful. And when they ceased to be, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared.
This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within, her own people rising against the system she ruled. But Catherine didn't panic. She acted. She dispatched professional military forces to crush the rebellion ruthlessly. Pugachev's forces were defeated. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a public warning to all who dared follow. Afterward, Catherine doubled down on order and control. Her dreams of liberating the serfs quietly faded into silence. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment, in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility, who offered loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The Empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reform became cautious. Surveillance increased. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out before it had breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a warning that haunted Catherine. That power built on inequality could only hold so long before the storm came crashing through. By the time Catherine the Great approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she had defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Catherine's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military wins. They were strategic pivots securing warm water ports and reshaping trade. But her legacy wasn't just drawn on maps. Catherine left a cultural mark as well. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe, and corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine put Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, founded schools for girls, and promoted the printing of books. She introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself, an act of scientific bravery in her time. Yet her reign was also one of contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom deeper into Russia's territories. Her reforms, while impressive, remained mostly top-down, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not inherited, it was crafted, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries.
She left behind a throne secure, an empire expanded, and a legend that would endure for generations. Catherine didn't just reign, she ruled with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her power, expansion, and enduring legacy, Catherine the Great was still, at her core, a woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her image. Behind the imperial portraits and state decrees was someone deeply aware of how precarious her position was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that didn't want a woman in charge. And yet, she not only endured, she thrived. Catherine was never content to be ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was intense. Hours of reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court filled with rival factions. She wasn't content to simply sit on the throne. She worked the throne like a stateswoman born to it. She was also, in many ways, lonely.
She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, yet wrote in her memoirs of how few people she could truly trust. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and kept away from state matters, grew into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Her greatest emotional partnership with Gregory Potemkin faded into deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Catherine crafted her image carefully. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it better than most monarchs of her age. She posed as Mother of Russia, enlightened monarch, warrior empress, and lover of the arts. But beneath those roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her by the title she never gave herself, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless or kind or just. It was because she took power and wielded it on her own terms in a time and place where women weren't supposed to have any. She didn't just wear the crown, she rewrote what it meant to deserve one.